Tanshi, and welcome to the Sickle and Sash podcast. My name is Josh Carrier McKenna, and I live on the ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations in so-called Vancouver, BC. I am Métis. My family's roots run deep in Treaty 1 territory of the Red River Valley in Manitoba. My family names include Carrier, Hamlin, Vandal, Parenteau, Landry, Laurence, McGilvery, and the unnamed Cree women that populate my family tree. Today we have Molly Swain with us. Molly Swain is an Otipemsu Isqueo from the Otusquenik in Treaty 7 territory, currently living on the lands of the Kwanlin Dun First Nation and Ta'an Quachan Council. She is a Métis anarcha-feminist, the co-host of Otipemsu Isqueo Wak Kitsi Gisiguk, Métis in Space, and co-founder of the Back to the Land, Too Furious Land Back project alongside Chelsea Vowell. Her past work has included abolitionist mutual aid and prefiguration with Free Lands, Free Peoples, labor organizing, harm reduction, and writing for various Indigenous radical and radical Indigenous publications. Molly and her co-conspirator Chelsea are currently writing a series of Métis futurist graphic novels based in the Métis in Space expanded universe. She is keen on Star Trek, anarchy, and karaoke. Molly, my apologies for my Cree pronunciation there. I'll pass it over to you.
You did so good. Thanks, Josh. Yeah, I'm excited to be here. I'm happy to be here. I love that you include some of your family name and where you're from. My family, we were pushed, originally came from Red River, pushed west and west, as colonialism sort of expanded into the prairies and settlement expanded into the prairies. Eventually ended up living in St. Peter's Mission in Montana, which is also where Riel ended up for a while prior to the Northwest resistance. Have a family member who fought and died in the resistance. And yeah, some of my family names, so Swain, Grant, Breland, Thibert, are some of my family names. And yeah, I'm excited to chat with you today.
Yeah, I'm hyped to get into it. I mean, today we're going to be talking about penal abolition, and I think we can just hop in right there. Penal abolition for the uninitiated. What does it mean, and what does it encompass?
Yeah, so penal abolition, I think most folks, especially after 2020 with the movement for Black Lives, really brought prison abolition into the public consciousness in a way that we'd never seen before, which is very exciting. So penal abolition is sort of an expansion of prison abolition, and it recognizes that there's more to sort of the carceral industrial complex than just prisons themselves. Penal abolition recognizes that there are, other institutions and other systems that feed into the prison industrial complex. So that includes things like the education system, includes child and family services, can include, things like psychotherapy and psychotherapeutic institutionalization. It's looking to recognize, what are these systems of control and domination in society that work to create, harbor, and expand prisons, policing, and those forms of extraction.
Mm. That's really interesting. So it's kind of more of a kind of nuanced, all-encompassing approach to kind of like police and prison abolition than just that kind of more surface level analysis of it.
Yeah, it's really about recognizing the ways in which prisons are sort of a outcome of an entire society built on domination and control and discipline. So, when prison abolitionists, for example, talk about the school to prison pipeline, or, we have lots of Indigenous folks up here who have talked about like the foster care to prison pipeline, right? So what are the ways in which different systems are related to one another and sort of use similar logics to the prison and to policing in order to organize certain populations or certain groups of people or certain individuals to be incarcerated, to be disciplined, to be controlled, to be extracted from their communities, from the land. Penal abolition really is just about, looking at prisons and saying, prisons are one facet of this, but prisons couldn't exist without all of these other institutions playing into this. So, penal abolition, it's about abolishing prisons, it's about abolishing police, but it's also about abolishing those carceral facets of these other institutions. So how does school, for example, discipline us? into behaving in ways that for some people are, again, are going to be organized into going to universities, reproducing the ruling class, etc. And, how are schools disciplining other students to, become part of these disposable populations, these populations that can be incarcerated, ignored, harmed, dominated, controlled.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's also like important to note when we talk about this sort of thing, because a lot of people who like, I don't know, are not really familiar with the way that we like analyze structures in terms of colonialism, might hear that and think like, wow, that's very like conspiracy theorist, like that all these things are connected and it's this whole like plan like to do something like a foster care to prison pipeline. But I think that one of the things that we like have to note when we talk about this sort of thing is the way that colonialism is all encompassing is, that these different structures just play into the same thing, where it's like the individuals who are working at a foster care facility or something like that probably are not structurally minded, thinking about how they're going to create a foster care to prison pipeline. And there certainly are some higher ups who I'm sure are aware of this sort of thing and are happy to perpetuate it, but it's got a lot of participants in it who are not seeing that full picture of like the whole pipeline that we're talking about here, right? But that's just how colonialism functions, right?
Yeah, yeah, and that's part of it, right? It's about, I think whenever we're talking about abolition, whether it be prisons, police, education, we're not necessarily saying that, there's some like evil, like bespectacled, top-hatted, mustache twirling, like puppet master behind the scenes, trying to make this all work out of the evil, in his heart or whatever, right? It's not about that. It's about, systems that have been built over a long period of time to achieve certain goals. And we know that under colonialism, the primary goal is the seizure of land. It's about eliminating the native, and opening up the land for settlement and resource extraction, whether that resource, and we know, like, especially, I shouldn't say especially in the States, but we hear about it more from the States, right? Like, that extraction can include bodies and labor of human beings as well, right? Through systems of slavery, through systems of the hyper-exploitation of migrants, et cetera, right? So that all takes place on the land. How do you prepare the land for that kind of settlement? And how do you maintain that kind of control to allow colonialism to continue to do its things, to allow that continued access? Penal abolition in a settler colonial context recognizes that the goal, or I shouldn't, again, like, it's not necessarily a goal in the sense that somebody's out there being like, here's our goal, here's our 5-year plan, but ultimately, like, all of these systems serve the same purpose, which is the elimination of the native and access to land for settlement and extraction.
Totally. To get more specifically into penal abolition again, I was hoping that we could like break down some of the different kind of phrases we hear to describe different approaches to different areas of penal abolition. And I know that there's a lot of confusion also after the heightened awareness following the movement for Black Lives, in terms of like which kind of slogan to get behind, and different people saying different things. Like we hear about anti-police brutality movements, we hear about defund the police, we hear about abolish the police, and there's certainly different backers for different aspects of that movement. Like you get some people who are saying abolish the police, while you have others who are going, no, we're not saying abolish the police, we're just saying defund the police. And it's like, I actually think some people are saying abolish the police too. Like, so what is going on here where we have all these different kind of aspects of similar movements that are kind of going in different directions and getting their wires crossed with each other, and the messaging is kind of getting mixed. Like, like what is the spectrum of anti-policing movements? Like, can you weigh in on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I first want to say, this is sort of, what language we use when we're trying to appeal to different, parts of the population or different individuals. Those are discussions that have been happening for decades. So I just first want to say that, abolition comes from the organizing and theorizing and analysis of Black women. So, we are always, like, it's always important to recognize our indebtedness to that labor that has been going on for, I believe at this point, over 100 years. And so I'm never gonna, like, I'm not interested in kind of like openly critiquing what kind of language people use necessarily, because I think it serves different functions at different times and places. For myself, like I choose to use specific kinds of language for specific reasons. And so maybe what I'll do is I'll start with the defund, right? This idea of defunding the police, defunding the prison industrial complex. So, and to be clear, like I haven't done a lot of like deep diving into like the very specific origins, but sort of how I was seeing it used, particularly, sort of 2014 to 2020, and especially, as things really started popping off in 2020 it was really seemed to be meant to be used almost like as a gateway to abolition, as how I was seeing a lot of people use it. I mean, there was definitely the liberal stance of like, oh, we just need to defund the police to a certain point because we've overfunded the police. And so that means the police are doing other people's jobs. They're doing the jobs of mental health professionals. They're doing the jobs of support workers and social workers. So we just need to lower that level of funding and then put that money into mental health support, into housing, into social workers. So there was that kind of liberal use of it. There was also the somewhat more radical understanding of defund, like we're going to introduce sort of the general public who's never thought about a world without police, who's never thought about a world without prisons. We're going to use this language to kind of ease them into this idea of abolition, right? Defund sounds less scary than abolish. Right? The idea of like police having, maybe a little bit less money or a little fewer resources. They can't buy 3 tanks. They can only buy 1 tank. They can't, run their helicopter 24/7, only 12 hours a day, right? Like it's a way to kind of bring it in with a level of kind of that respectability politics, right? Recognizing that folks are going to be afraid of ideas, or they might be afraid of ideas that are that radical. So we need to sell it to them. So we're going to use this language of defund, but for a lot of people who are using that language, they're using it to appeal to a certain group of people, but in reality, like they want to defund it to $0. So that's kind of how I was seeing defund the police. Anti-police brutality, definitely part of the overall anti-police movement, penal abolition, or can be. And that's pointing to, often really overt acts of police brutality. So of course, the well-publicized murders of like Black folks in the US, for example, who, like at this point, folks are filming people being murdered by cops. Or, you hear stories up here of folks being brutalized by police, by RCMP. And so some of those more overt acts of violence that the police undertake, recognizing, of course, that the existence of police in and of itself is a violence, but often anti-police brutality focuses kind of on those really overt actions of the police that, even folks kind of without that broader structural analysis of what policing is are going to, understand that, like a cop beating a disabled guy to death with a baton is police brutality. Cops pepper spraying protesters sitting in front of a bank is brutality, etc. So that focus, that anti-police brutality focus, is often focused on we just need to make police nicer. We need to make police safer. We need to make policing less lethal. Of course, there are radical elements of the anti-police brutality movement as well, who recognize that police brutality is like one manifestation of the overall violence of policing. And they use sort of examples of police brutality to sort of underscore policing's structural role in society. But the focus there really does tend to be on policing in and of itself, rather than I won't say that it doesn't ignore the connections to prisons. It doesn't ignore connections to education, mental health care, et cetera, because of course we know, right, like school resource officers in prisons or in schools, I should say. Like we recognize, and we're seeing it more and more, right? Police brutalizing children in schools as part of their roles. But the focus, I think, with a lot of anti-police brutality organizers and movements really does tend to be sort of on policing itself rather than sort of its broader role in society. And then finally, abolishing the police. Those are the folks that, said like, we're not going to dress this up We're not going to put like a nice liberal veneer on anything. We're just going to say it like it is. We need to abolish the police. We need to get rid of policing as a structure. We need to get rid of policing as a logic that helps us organize society. And those are the folks who are, they're just like, this simply needs to happen, whether or not it makes people uncomfortable, whether or not some people are going to think it's kind of scary. This is just the language we're going to use because this is what we want. And, what we saw, of course, in sort of as the movement for Black Lives, the big kind of uprising in the States and or so-called States and so-called Canada, as things have sort of settled down a little bit, we're seeing the co-optation of a lot of the language that people were using during the movement for Black Lives, right? So defund really got co-opted. Anti-racism, even the term anti-racism really got co-opted. Abolition, there have been attempts to co-opt abolition, right? To defang these terms, to defang this language, and so then to defang those ideas, right? And to bring things back to the status quo where this idea that we need police, we need prisons is very naturalized in our society. So I think, I saw a lot of folks really deliberately choosing to use the language of abolition, even if it did seem more confrontational, in order to try to resist that kind of co-optation and that kind of defanging.
Yeah, I think that it is interesting, that there's languages used strategically because of how scary some of it is. And like you were saying, where there's a lot of people who just can't imagine a world without policing. I think that's true for probably the majority of the population, is that, our entire lives we are kind of exposed to policing propaganda, the whole idea of the thin blue line, that this is the thin blue line that is separating us from all out chaos or anarchy, if that's a bad thing. So yeah, I was wondering if you've done it seems like you do a lot of education on this, so I imagine that you have had to have some conversations with people who are probably being who are not easy to communicate these kind of topics to. So I was wondering what some strategies you found helpful are for imagining otherwise in terms of a future where penal abolition is fully realized, and just how we can have these techniques of imagining otherwise that can kind of break through that veil of policing and prison propaganda.
Oh, I love that question. I think that is probably one of the most important questions that you can ask if you are at all curious about penal abolition, if you are at all curious about, even just why people might be into penal abolition, why people might think that it's better to not have prisons, not have police. That I think is absolutely the most important question, is how do we imagine otherwise? Because you're absolutely right. We are absolutely inundated in this continent in particular with policing propaganda and prison propaganda. Everything from news media, fear-mongering news media, to, every Marvel movie ever made, to every cop show on TV. It's absolutely bananas. Even 30 years ago, say, people were the movie Blade, for example, is a great one. Blade is so anti-cop. It's absolutely amazing.
I don't think I've seen it, actually.
Or Total Recall. One of the subplots of Total Recall is a bunch of disabled sex workers going to war against the police on Mars. That's amazing. We don't see that kind of thing today. So I guess one of the obvious ones, which maybe considering my podcasting background is kind of obvious, is science fiction. I think science fiction is an incredible tool that helps us to imagine otherwise. It allows you to build worlds and ask questions about, where we are, who we are, what is the nature of life, what is the nature of relations with one another, how do we live together, how do we solve problems? You can play all of those things out, and those things have been played out over and over again in science fiction in all sorts of amazing new ways. And it can be a really good tool to start thinking about, what would a world without police and prisons look like? What would a world where we are recentering our relationships with one another and with the land, what would that really look like? How do we get there? So sci-fi is always going to be high on my list. other tools. I mean, you can't go wrong with just all of the amazing work that's already been done. One of the great things about abolition, especially at this point, is you don't need to reinvent the wheel on anything. There's been absolutely brilliant theorizing and analysis, again, for decades and decades, from some absolutely amazing thinkers. So L. Jones, Robin Maynard, God, now I'm forgetting everybody's name. Actually, maybe I shouldn't even be, like, this is a TELUS thing. Should I even be naming people? I don't know. But anyway, so folks that have published, so like, and of course, Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, all the way back to Lucy Parsons. We're getting more. Freelance Free Peoples has a chapter in the book. It's either Disarm, Defund, Dismantle, or Defund, Disarm, Dismantle. But it's a book, an anthology specifically about abolition in Canada, which is one of the first of its kind, for sure, an anthology like that. Turning to those thinkers, those writers, and, that doesn't even begin to touch on all of the amazing theorizing art and creating that people that are incarcerated have done. Right. We tend to forget, like, you and I are both sort of in academia. So we tend to turn to academics for, a lot of the people that we're getting our information from. But, folks have been writing and creating art in prisons for centuries. Right. Indigenous people were creating art imprisoned by the United States government during the Indian Wars. Folks would be shipped off to prisons, hundreds of kilometers away and make the most incredible art while incarcerated. We have these long histories, right? And I always say that, as Indigenous people, we're lucky enough that we can imagine otherwise, but we can also remember otherwise, right? And that's, I guess, like maybe one of the best tools for us that we can turn to is we all have those memories, those cultural foundations of how to live together without prisons and without policing. Prior to colonization, there were no cops, and you didn't get locked up. And certainly not for decades, and certainly not with thousands and thousands of other people. So, I mean, again, I think some of the big ones are, don't be afraid of using your imagination, whether that be science fiction or, other creative endeavors and pursuits, right? Like, science fiction is all about, bending, breaking, trying new things, right? And that's kind of what abolition is about too. Reading, listening to podcasts, YouTube videos, lectures, whatever it is, the work is out there. You do not have to invent it. Going out into your community, meeting people, going into prisons, volunteering in prisons, right? If you've got skills, how do you bring them to the movement? And then again, right, like as Indigenous people, we're so lucky, I think, particularly compared to Europeans who have been just like so inculcated in their own whiteness and their own, that drive for domination, that drive for possessiveness, but we're lucky enough that we still have those cultural foundations. And there's a lot of nations like within living memory who are still using their own justice traditions. And I think we all are, in ways big and small, just how we move through the world, right? How we understand and uphold our own laws, of course. But there are also, folks who were living pretty much, pretty traditionally up until like sometimes the 60s, the 70s, right? And so we have this like incredible wealth of knowledge to draw on for how do we relate to one another in ways outside of these carceral systems.
Yeah. I want to jump more into that on like how we existed without, like how our societies functioned without police and prisons. But before we get into that, I just want to get through some of these kind of like basic kind of questions that everyone seems to ask when they're not familiar with kind of like abolition movements. But I also wanted to note too that on your topic, or on your point about sci-fi being such a important tool to imagining otherwise, I think it's the truth of that statement is reinforced by what kind of like police propaganda in storytellings does for just this idea of this need for policing in prisons. Like, I think like one of the things that you always hear people say about like what would happen if the police were abolished. It's like, well, who are you going to call when there's an emergency or someone breaks into your house or someone comes up to you and threatens to kill you or something like that? Or you have like home intruders. And I've had that said to me like quite a few times. But then I started to ask people, I was like, have you ever been in an experience where like the police have like directly saved your life? And everyone's like, I don't think I've actually met someone who has said yes. And, you know, certainly I'm sure that there are cases where like someone has like been in a situation where someone's broken into their home and they've called 911 and it's like, it's, you know, being helpful in certain situations. But I think this kind of thing that you see in like mainstream movies so much, where it's like the police always come to the rescue, and like I'm a huge horror fan, and it's like always like the moment of relief is when you finally see the sirens flashing through the window and, oh, we're safe now, the movie's wrapping up, you know? And so it's interesting how how that sort of thing just kind of breeds this idea of lurking danger that only the police can solve at all times. So I would imagine that the opposite is very true in terms of science fiction that just imagines a different world. And I mean, sci-fi has been doing that for centuries too. Not necessarily like outside of policing as well, you know. So
yeah. And, you know, I think you made a really good point, which is that, you know, police don't do what we're told police do. Police do not prevent crime. Police, like, if you call the cops, something's already happened. And the reason why something's already happened, you know, if we're talking about, like, say, for example, a break-in, is likely because of broader societal conditions, right? We're sort of taught that, like, criminals or bad guys are just kind of inherently bad, completely divorced from, you know, the structures, the systems, the social forces that, you know, act on all of us. For some reason, there's just something wrong with those people, right? And that's who we need to be protected from, right? And you know, as Indigenous people, we know that when those narratives are being put forward, they're talking about our cousins and our uncles and our grandmas. Like, this is, you know, like, so, you know, prisons and policing on these lands are really about containing Indigenous people and doing, you know, and controlling, you know, not just, and, you know, to be perfectly clear, not just Indigenous people, but, you know, as I'm sure you know, like, we are a huge percentage of the incarcerated population in this country. And there are specific reasons for that. And so what does that mean when, you know, the propaganda that we're being fed, both out of the so-called United States and, you know, in so-called Canada, these cop shows and, you know, the news of, you know, like really sort of florid descriptions of crimes and et cetera, right? What does it mean when, you know, we're told that a criminal is a certain type of person who's devoid of a soul, not deserving of rights, freedoms, relations, when we know that they're talking about our relatives, right? And we know that, like, you know, there's the figure of the criminal and there's the figure of the heroic police officer, when every single day we see on the streets downtown in every major city in this country, we see cops are bullies and they're cowards. They do not prevent crime, and they're not really interested or capable of solving crime. The solve rate for police cases is laughably low, right? We know that. We know that if you are marginalized, if you are, you know, even if you're a white woman, even if you're a cisgender, able-bodied white woman, they're still not going to take you seriously if you come and you tell them you've been sexually assaulted, right? They do not do what we tell them to do. So, you know, when you brought up the fact that, like, if you go around and you ask people, like, has a police officer saved you from crime, and you can't find a single person who could say yes, that's a pretty good sign, right? And I think one of the interesting things about abolition is we can imagine otherwise, but we can also do the work of just recognizing, you know, what's right in front of our faces, right? Like, what does the data tell us? What do the statistics tell us? What do our own experiences tell us? Are cops keeping us safe? And what are they keeping us safe from? From poverty? From the effects of poverty in our communities? From the effects of colonialism? From the trauma of endemic, constant violence for centuries? With more violence? Yeah, I don't know. I think like as soon as you start to sort of ask those kinds of questions, you start to really kind of see into the heart of the issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of answers one of the other questions I was going to pose to you, that, does removing police from society result in chaos? And I think that you've kind of already answered that in terms of saying there is already quite a bit of chaos, and it doesn't seem like they're really helping with it.
One of something that I once heard an abolitionist say that's really stuck with me, I should say, over the years. And this was somebody who was involved in expanding Indigenous access to ceremony in prisons. This person basically said, like, if all police and prisons vanished tomorrow, the net level of violence in our society would decrease. Which is the other thing that, society loves to obfuscate for us, loves to hide from us, which is that prisons and policing are so incredibly violent in and of themselves, which is part of the reason why society, all of these structural forces work together to present us with the completely unsympathetic figure of a criminal, because that means that they become disposable and you can do anything you want to them. It means that they become an acceptable target for the violence of prison and policing.
Yeah, like they deserve it, sort of thing.
Exactly. And unfortunately, we're really seeing that right now in sort of actually across the country. All sorts of talks about mandatory minimum sentencing, about tightening up bail conditions, about, dangerous offenders, all this fear mongering. It makes us afraid of one another. It makes us afraid to go out in our communities. And it means that folks who, may perpetuate some of these behaviors, or maybe just, are even suspected to, or folks, who are charged but not convicted, folks in remand, whatever it might be, it moves that Overton window, right? It raises that level of acceptability so that we allow for that treatment of these folks who are portrayed as, inherently bad, something's inherently wrong with them. We need to be protected from them, right? And so when you do that, and there's no discussion of how dehumanizing that is, particularly in the context of settler colonialism and anti-Blackness, right? These are stereotypes that have been with us since contact, and they exist for very specific reasons.
Yeah, and I think that does go to show how it really is like a dehumanizing process to put someone in prison, and the statistics show us that it does not rehabilitate anyone. It makes them it makes a lot of people incapable of being reintroduced to regular society, even after being released, if they do get released. But I think one thing that we can address here that is, again, going to be a question that a lot of people have is, even though I would say most people who are sent to prison are not, it's totally unnecessary to pull them out of society, but there's certain cases here and there where someone has proven themselves to be unfit to be in regular society with people. For example, let's go extreme here. Someone like Ted Bundy, he can't just live in his community anymore. So what do we do in a situation like that? Do we force someone to go to some sort of counseling? And then if we did that, is that really that different from prisons? How do we handle the really, not just a focus on all of the outstanding cases, but this is the kind of questions that people who aren't really willing to engage in the theory but just want to throw questions out are going to ask, right? What do you think about that sort of thing?
I mean, I think that's a great question. And I think it's, those are questions that, and folks, questions and answers that have been thrown around, again, for decades. But, one thing that I always think about when I get a question like that is the people who cause the most harm in society. And now, because of the connectivity and because of trade networks and stuff, this is globally. people who cause the most harm in the world are walking free. Henry Kissinger died a natural death at the age of 100, having never seen a day in prison. And he's responsible for the death of arguably millions of people. So there's this focus on this idea of this kind of deviant individual who is this outlier who commits these horrible, again, like very theatrical crimes, and they're the ones that we need to be afraid of. And they're the ones that we need to be protected from. But meanwhile, the Trudeau government is sending tens of millions of dollars of weapons to Israel, which is committing a genocide. We have, we know who the people who are causing the most violence and harm in our society are. But they're often the ones who have the most social power. They're often the ones who have the most resources, the most capital, who have that veneer of respectability because we live in a society that is built on violence, because it's a settler colonial society. So that control, that domination, and that kind of violence is acceptable. So prisons and policing do not address the biggest harms in our society. I would argue they don't address any harms in our society, but they don't even get close to touching the biggest harms or the most intense perpetrators of violence, because they are perpetrators of violence and they work for the perpetrators of violence. So and I know that's kind of dodging your question a little bit, and I don't mean to do that. Because we know, this, and it's kind of a long answer, right? Because I think there's a bunch of parts to consider, right? People are sort of like, what about the rapists? What about the murderers? But, there's other things at play here, right? So we've talked a little bit about poverty and the role of poverty, and marginalization and colonization in sort of this idea of crime and who becomes a criminal. And we know, data shows over and over and over again, that when poverty is reduced, crime is reduced. When poverty goes up, crime goes up. When marginalization increases, crime increases. When there's more equality, there's more equity in the world, there's less crime. When resources are distributed more equitably, that's a huge, huge indicator of the health of a society, and it's a huge indicator and a huge predictor of where crime levels are going to be. It is actually, and this is really important to remember, it's actually in police and prisons' best interest for crime rates to be high. Because it helps justify their massively overinflated budgets, help justify, the fact that somebody with 6 months of training and a high school degree can go and make more than you and I'll make in a first year professorship position, or, whatever it might be, right? They need people to be afraid, and they need people to be afraid of each other in order to justify their own existence. So that's the other piece. And then when it comes to because I don't think any abolitionist is going to argue that, we're going to live in this ideal utopian society where everybody gets along perfectly all the time. There's never conflict, et cetera, et cetera. And for sure, there are going to be people who behave in ways that are considered socially unacceptable. But you've already mentioned, right? Prisons don't solve that problem. Prisons don't, create a healthy, well-balanced individual ready to get back into society. That's not what they're made for. That's not what they do. And our peoples, have had millennia, and most peoples around the world have existed without policing in prisons and have had millennia to figure out, what's the best way of dealing with that. We know, for example, in a lot of Indigenous nations, when somebody does something, quote unquote, antisocial, it's often seen as an illness rather than a fundamental defect or, a penchant for violence or whatever, right? That person is often seen as needing help, needing healing, needing to be brought closer into community. One of the things that's so amazing about abolitionism is that it asks us to step towards people that we are told are disposable, dangerous, and bad and wrong. In this society, we push away difference. Settler colonial society is afraid of difference. It pushes it away. It isolates it. And it tries to contain it and eradicate it wherever possible. Abolition asks us to bring people in. It asks us to recognize that often, what we see as crime is the result of a lack of resources, a lack of poverty. It's the result of violence itself. right? That classic, like, hurt people, right? It sounds a little trite, but it is the case. So for example, I think it's something like, it's close to 100% of Indigenous women in prison have experienced violence. If not 100, I would be shocked if it wasn't 100% actually. So how does, and we know that prisons are violent, so how does exposing somebody to additional violence when they have both experienced and committed violence themselves, does that stop anything? Does that support any sort of new way of living and being in the world for our communities? Does that support the individual who has done harm? Does it support the individuals they may have harmed? Right? And so we can look back and say, like, here's how our communities may have dealt with this in the past. And, I don't want to say it's all rosy, right? It's not like abolition isn't a group hug. It's hard work. It's hard and it's tough. And sometimes there are no right answers. And we know that traditionally, some of our forms of justice were very harsh. But none of them locked people into a concrete box for 20 years.
Yeah. Yeah, I think kind of one of my main takeaways from what you were just saying there is that these kind of outlying cases of like the extremes, like the example I gave you of like Ted Bundy or something like that, are kind of like used as a means of like distracting from like addressing the actual issues of policing in prison. I think maybe comparably in a way like how personal responsibility is pushed so hard with the kind of like environmentalism movement, where it's like such a push for us to like recycle all our own things and to stop using plastic straws and use paper straws instead. And it's like, I don't know, we're busy arguing about paper straws when there's like less than 10 corporations who are responsible for, I believe, like over 50% of the pollution in the world. So it's like, sure, I guess paper straws are technically better than plastic straws, but like that's not the real issue here. So it's like, sure, there's certainly cases like the Ted Bundy where he's probably not like okay to be just walking down the street in the middle of the city sort of thing, but that is like something that I feel like we need to develop our own justice traditions around, like even bringing our justice traditions back, because it seems like we outsource justice to the police and prisons, and we're totally detached from how we want to handle this sort of thing.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I mean, but it is a tough one, because for people who already have their walls up, who don't want to engage with this like imagining otherwise and the theory of abolition, a lot of people's minds will just go to the most extreme scenarios and they'll be like, well, I don't want this person walking free, and they'll just leave it at that. So yeah, but it's a tough topic, right?
There's also lots of real life examples of, some of those like scary serial killer types. And we know that often police either, indirectly facilitated those murders, or, all of the evidence was right there in front of them and nothing was done about it, right? So like Robert Pickton is the classic example, right? Police knew that Indigenous sex workers were going missing, and they just sat on it and sat on it and sat on it, right? So again, like when we're thinking, obviously, like what do we do about the rapists and the murderers is, it can be a straw man question. It can be, a very sincere question. But at the end of the day, what are we doing now about the rapists and murderers, right? Like we know that like fewer than 5% of rapists will ever be held accountable. We know that, some of these really scary murderers and stuff are out there in large part because of the ineffectiveness of police, or sometimes with the blessing of police, whether, explicitly or implicitly, right? So, thinking again about it, to me, it all boils down to relationships, right? Like strong community where you know your community members, you know your neighbors, you're talking with one another, you depend on one another, right? That interrelationality is so, so important in that imagining and remembering otherwise, because that's how we keep each other safe. We don't outsource it, right? Exactly as you're talking about. We don't put that responsibility onto other people. We accept that responsibility that we have to one another in our communities. And that's what helps keep us safe, right? And Indigenous people have known that forever, because we've never been able to rely on the police. We've never been able to trust that we're going to get justice from this system. And so there's so many stories, of Métis relying on each other, skipping the cops, protecting each other from police, right? That's what we do. And, one of the bummer things, and I know you're probably going to want to chat about this, one of the bummer things that we're seeing with sort of an increase in sort of the equity, diversity, inclusion initiatives with the cops is that, we're being given this veneer of safety with Indigenous faces in policing that simply doesn't exist.
I think it would be great to chat about that too, because that is, I think the main reformist argument for people who it's a very, neoliberal argument for those who are like, well, the police have been racist in the past, so we just need to have less white police officers. We need to, use some of that police funding to outreach and hire Indigenous people and other BIPOC people to be police officers. And then they're going to know what it's like to be Indigenous, so they're not going to prey on Indigenous people in the same way. But what would you say is the main issue there? Why isn't that going to fix the problem?
I mean, I think there's a few things, and it might be a little crass and not entirely appropriate, but I will say that NWA warned us about this decades ago, with Black police showing out for the white cop. As Indigenous people, we are in no way immune to those dynamics. I will also say that, that again, right, there's this real tendency to individualize in settler society, right? So if we just get the right individuals in the system will change, right? That incremental change from the inside, et cetera, et cetera. But we know that prisons and policing aren't bad because the people that are in them are necessarily all completely evil, soulless monsters. The purpose of police and the purpose of prisons mean that they cannot be reformed. So I don't know if you're familiar with the phrase, the purpose of a system is what it does.
No, I'm not familiar.
Okay, so it's sort of become a byword for me a little bit, because it's really useful to kind of cut through a lot of the propaganda. The purpose of a system is what it does, then why would reform ever work? So if the purpose of policing is to keep people safe, why doesn't policing keep people safe? If the purpose of prisons is to rehabilitate people and, teach them a lesson and teach them how to be productive members of society or whatever, right? Why is it that recidivism rates are so high? Maybe it's because what they're telling us the purpose of these systems isn't actually the purpose. Maybe we need to look at what these systems actually do. We look at the data. We look at the tendencies. We look at and analyze what's right in front of our eyes to understand what these systems do.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I've thought about that sort of thing, and analyzing what these systems do and what they're meant to do, is in terms of structures, like just being vague here, in terms of structures that have or do cause harm, I think that, and of course you have to analyze on a case-by-case basis, but I think that structures who have strayed from their original purpose and now are causing harm, there is potential for reform there. But structures that are just continuing to fulfill their original purpose cannot be reformed into something different. And I think that's the case for policing, because one thing that I always come back to, like, the policing started in Canada when the first Prime Minister of Canada, John A. Macdonald, started the Northwest Mounted Police, which became the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in 1873. And he, in his own words, like, the purpose of developing the Northwest Mounted Police was to clear the plains of Indians. And if you look at the statistics for the people that the police have killed in one of the most recent decades that we have statistics for, which is between 2007 and 2017, over 1/3 of the people killed by the RCMP are Indigenous, and we make up less than 5% of the population of so-called Canada. So that right there, to me, is enough to look at that and go, that's over 100 years of policing in Canada, and it's still doing the same thing. So I don't really think that really there's room to reform that. I think it's proven what it's meant to do and that it's very efficient at that. And there's not, they've gone way past any sort of grace period that could be afforded to, like, well, we're going to no, it's been like 150 years. It's not going to change, you know? So.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. And I think it, you know, one of the things too we see with police in particular, and prison guards as well, right, is like you do get people in there who go in there with the best intentions, right? They want to make that change from the inside. They want to, you know, stand up against corruption or, you know, whatever they go in there with. Their intentions are genuinely good. And what we see over and over and over again is that they're disciplined into conformity or they're removed. In fact, you know, we've seen situations in which people have been killed. Cops have been killed by cops because, I mean, there was a wild case out of LA because the cop stepped out of line, right? Like the thin blue line is about disciplining police's own ranks as much as it is about disciplining everybody else, as much about police, like as much as it is about police pride. And that's really important to remember, right? Like, you're absolutely right. Policing in this country exists to remove and contain Indigenous people to facilitate settler access to Indigenous lands. Prisons I mean, one of the things that strikes me every time I think about it is that prior, like when the pass system was in place, there was almost no Indigenous incarceration. When First Nations couldn't leave the reserve without getting a pass from the Indian agent, almost no Natives in prison. Then in the 50s, when that was finally changed, all of a sudden you start seeing a steady and like pretty steep increase in Indigenous people being incarcerated. Like, reserves were doing the work that prisons are today, of that containment, that removal. And they continue to. And one of the things that we see with a lot of attempts to reform these systems is it actually just works to expand them, right? None of these reforms have done anything except for expand and extend the reach of prisons and policing. Right? Like, when I was a kid, there were no cops in my school. In my elementary school, there was no cop. We got visits from cops to propagandize to us, but we didn't have a police officer.
Yeah.
Now my nibblings go to high school and they have school resource officers who conduct stings on the student population, who do entrapment schemes against students, against minors, who won't let these kids talk to their parents until they sign confessions. It's absolutely bananas. It's appalling to think about. But it's that steady creep because we tell ourselves, and society tells us over and over and over again, that the purpose of the system isn't what it does. The purpose is what we say that it does. And if we're not actually doing it, we just need to give more money. We need to give more resources. We need to reform. We need to make it nicer. We need to make it more diversity, equity, and inclusion. We need to make it more anti-racist. But all that ever seems to do is expand the reach of these systems and expand their hold over us.
Yeah, and I think it's like what in the aftermath of the kind of rise in popularity of like defund the police and abolish the police movements in the past few years. I think it's nearly every police department in Canada and the United States has actually seen an increase in budget.
Yeah. They've seen an increase in budget. And I can, the EPS, Edmonton Police Service, had the distinction of being, I believe it was the second deadliest police force in the country this year, possibly the first, but I believe it was the second. And this is just a couple of years after the police chief, Dale McPhee, decided to unilaterally declare, because of course he would know, that Edmonton Police Service is in fact an anti-racist policing service. And yet, here we are.
I think that's kind of an oxymoron, wouldn't you say?
I would agree with that. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, a bold statement, an audacious statement. But
yeah.
I mean, and for a lot of people, particularly people in power and for people with privilege, hearing that is enough of a justification for them.
Mm-hmm. I think from there, let's maybe hop into more specifically, like, the way that Indigenous people play into all of this, and this is kind of something that you've touched on a bit with, like, the role that police play in terms of, like, controlling natives. But would you say that policing then is inherently tied to colonialism, and one can't really decolonize without also engaging in penal abolition? Because decolonizing is really one of those, like, terms that has been sort of appropriated, like you were saying earlier, and defanged, So yeah, do you have your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so, we need to understand police are the armed wing of the settler colonial system. They exist to uphold and enforce the interests of settler colonizers under capitalism. As such, I personally don't believe that, when we're imagining otherwise into a decolonized or anti-colonial future, that there is room for police or prisons. Absolutely not. Firstly, there would be no need for them. I would argue there's no need for them now, but because we live in a system that deliberately disenfranchises huge amounts of the population, huge numbers of people, disenfranchises, marginalizes, impoverishes, oppresses, and gives rise to the conditions under which, people commit harm. Or, often it's not even committing harm, right? Like, we know how many people are in remand or in prison for, like, property crimes where nobody's harmed. Somebody's, like, skidoo gets stolen, right? But be that as it may, right? Whether we're talking about sort of interpersonal harm, or even harm to property, we come from a tradition where everybody is taken care of. Everybody is resourced by the community. We all pool together to help one another out and to make sure that we all have what we need to get by. Whereas, cops exist to defend the status quo. They exist to defend those in power. They exist to defend the agents of capital and the institutions of capital that create and maintain these divisions of resources and these divisions of, rich and poor, racial divisions, gender divisions, right? So I genuinely believe that, when we're imagining otherwise into a decolonial or anti-colonial future, there's no room for policing and prisons, because policing and prisons are antithetical to that work. They cannot coexist. You cannot reform something out of its basic purpose.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of, like, getting more into the imagining otherwise, and this is something that you alluded to earlier, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how Métis communities and other Indigenous communities from Turtle Island view justice differently without incorporating the presence of police, and kind of maybe some of the main things that have stuck out to you as to, like, what we can learn from these societal models that have never operated with a police presence prior to colonization.
Yeah, so I think, we've touched on some of them already. One of the ones that I think is incredibly useful, or an analytical lens that I've always found incredibly useful, is to think about, a lot of people understood crime, interpersonal harm, antisocial behavior, etc., as an illness or an imbalance in an individual, or sometimes even in a community. right? And so what does it mean when we look at somebody's poor behavior that way? It means that we're spreading out that responsibility to all of us. You know, what did we do that created the conditions that allowed for this? How do we help heal that person to bring them back into community? You also see a lot of Indigenous peoples, again, really stepping in and stepping towards a person who's caused harm rather than pushing them out, right? Working to welcome them back into community, welcome them back in, show them, you know, why their behavior was unacceptable, what can be done differently, giving them those tools and those supports, working with them. And often, like, and that's not sort of touchy-feely, like, kumbaya stuff. That was hard work. That's hard, like, you know, you hear stories of alternative justice measures where somebody, you know, in order to avoid prison time, somebody, you know, is given another option that is more like that, right? So, for example, regularly meeting with, sometimes even living with the family of somebody who was murdered. Their murderer will go live with them and they'd rather go to prison because it is so much harder to do the work, the relational work of confronting what you've done and being accountable for it. Right? So things like that, I think can be really interesting and important. So there's a great story, it's a historical event where it's the Métis and the Dakota, I believe, where basically there was like a series of raids back and forth, and I hope I don't get these details wrong. Some Métis killed some Dakota warriors, and as part of the political diplomacy process, those Métis were adopted into those Dakota families, essentially to take on the role of the men that they had killed. And so they would have those same family responsibilities as those folks. Could you imagine that happening today? And that was with the consent of everybody involved too. And that's like, it's such a wildly different way of looking at justice and looking at reparation. And again, that's, you know, that was part of a broader diplomacy thing. It helped to stave off, you know, potentially a bigger conflict, possibly like an international war. But it gives it like, it kind of shows you how are people conceiving of justice. So that's another one. And, you know, when we see that in our communities now too, right, where people are causing harm, and we do our best not to render them disposable, right? We try to find alternatives. And like folks have been working in the system and outside of the system to make that happen, you know, for decades now. And often, unfortunately, it does get co-opted. So I think, you know, there's so much inspiration that we can take sort of from our own traditions, but also work that's happening today.
Yeah. I think something really interesting about that example you just gave of the Métis and the Dakota was just the way that justice played out emphasizes the lives that were taken away and the absence of those lives from their community and the roles that they filled. Whereas like the kind of punishment model of just being sent to prison just emphasizes that like, that's really going to suck if I have to go to prison now. You know, like it kind of removes the person who was victimized from the whole equation. Whereas like there's something much more relational about that sort of justice of now you have to fill their role in the community and just see all of the things that they brought to this that you took away, you know? Like, it's like you really have to, they would have really had to own up to what they did and really understand the implication of how serious it is to take a life. You know, that's not something that I think prisons really make anyone feel.
Absolutely not. Because, you know, the other thing too is there's, again, thinking about Indigenous women in prison, but just people in prison in general, right? Like they are members of communities, and their loss, their removal into prisons creates a huge hole for every single person. So you have kids growing up without parents, you have siblings growing up without siblings, you have parents who can't see their children. The list goes, you know, it just goes on and on, right? And so, you know, in my mind, we need to be looking at, you know, sort of I never say the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in prison, because again, the purpose of a system is what it does. But the high numbers of Indigenous people in prisons, it's the same kind of removal that we've seen with foster care, with child and family services, with the 60 Scoop, with residential schools, right? That removal piece tears the heart out of our communities, and it perpetuates that violence. Because, when you don't have those strong community supports, whether you're in prison or just you're still in the community, then, it creates the very same conditions that perpetuate, crime. Perpetuates harm, and it's harm that's spread beyond that individual, right? Where I think when you think about the implications of sort of, the Métis Dakota solution, it works to start to address some of that harm rather than perpetuate it. So instead of two people being removed from two communities, you have a person who committed harm, who removed somebody from their community, who now has an obligation to try to fulfill both those roles. And so those community ties aren't broken for either community, ideally.
Yeah. Yeah, such an interesting model. It's wild because it does, it makes a lot of sense, but it's just never something that you would just hear in day-to-day life in I don't know, I can speak to my own community and just day-to-day life, just hanging out in Vancouver, nobody would ever suggest something like that. But it's wild.
Yeah. And again, that's not a model that's going to work for everybody, right? One of the things that, abolition needs to keep centered is, not only just accountability and healing for somebody who commits harm, but also healing and the well-being and the support of people who have been victimized or have experienced harm as well. And also recognizing that those two things aren't dichotomous. They often exist in the same person. So again, I'm not out here suggesting that the answer is for people who have committed harm to adopt the people, or to be adopted by the people who they have harmed, right? Across the board. But that kind of thinking and sort of the worldview that underscores, that dynamic is one I think that really is worth sitting with and really diving into.
I think it's a great example for how it worked in that scenario. But I think also what you're speaking to here as well is that community-oriented justice systems, especially influenced by the systems that we used to operate under, and I don't want to say used to entirely, because I'm sure that there's a lot of people in our communities that are still operating with these systems, but not only allows us to kind of set precedents for some of these scenarios, but also to analyze these things on a case-by-case basis. Because like you said, that solution won't work for everyone or every scenario. But when we have more community involvement in that, we can find things that work best for every situation.
And that's, I think, another important thing, right, is the tendency to homogenize, I think, is kind of a settler colonial tendency. This tendency to just say, okay, here's a blanket solution or a blanket method for dealing with these problems. Okay, now go. The system itself has kind of recognized that that's not really going to work, right? So we have things like Gladue reports as one of these reform attempts within prisons, right? So a Gladue report, if you're not familiar, or your listeners are not familiar, is basically a submission that somebody who's accused of a crime can make if they're Indigenous, to describe essentially adverse impacts that they've had throughout their life, that they want the judge or whoever's doing the sentencing to take into account. And that's meant to help reduce sentencing, to try to funnel people away from prisons into alternative justice projects, etc. The data show that Gladue reports don't really make an impact, but it does point to this recognition that, again, these really homogenized, one-size-fits-all responses to harm are not effective, and they're not, it's not necessarily the best way to go about doing it.
Totally. One other thing I was hoping to touch on with you, and then I wanted to ask you a few questions about free lands, free peoples, but when do you think this shift happened in our communities? And maybe I'll speak specifically to Métis communities here, because I feel like I've seen in Métis communities like a lot of like pro-policing sentiment. And like, when do you think that this shift happened? Because I think like clearly like we used to be anti-police. Like it's like all of our historic battles were between us and the RCMP. But then it seems like there's this shift now where a lot of us and a lot of the general public, like anybody who knows anything about like Indigenous rights will say like, okay, well, the police were an issue at one point, but now they've changed. Right? Like we've already kind of touched on the fact that they haven't really changed given the statistics, but there's this general consensus and idea that they have. And it feels like we just are just okay to roll with that fantasy. Like one of the biggest examples I can see of it that always bothers me every year. I don't know if you've ever been to the Back to Batoche Festival.
I haven't been, but I've been to other events. I think I know where you're going with this.
So it's great for what it is. I really like a lot of it. But there are certainly some critiques for it. For those who are unaware of what it is, it's probably the one of, if not the largest annual Métis gathering that takes place in Batoche, which is the historic site where our battle between the Battle of Batoche between the Métis and the RCMP took place, and we lost, and Louis Riel was captured and then executed afterwards. It's actually where my great uncle fought there and died in battle and everything. So my family's got a lot of connections to it. But so I've been going for the past 2 years, and each time they start off the festival the first day by having everyone sing "O Canada," which already sets a weird mood, and then by parading Métis RCMP members through the like main gathering space. And having them walk through in their full uniforms with their sashes on. For some reason, because like the only thing that the RCMP have to do with the event is that they were the ones who were killing us there, like back when the battle took place. And now somehow it's like we've gotten so backwards that our grand opening of the festival is honoring Métis who have joined the RCMP. Like, I don't really like, when did this shift happen? Like, do you have like any sense as to like when this kind of propaganda just took over and we just started living in this kind of fantasy world?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I will say, like, I think firstly, you're totally right that a lot of Métis have always been very virulently anti-cop. There are some great quotes that, I know this is PG, so I can't share them here, but there's some great quotes from Métis women during and like in the lead up to the Northwest Resistance about police. But
feel free to share them and we can censor anything we need to.
Oh, okay. Well, there's this great one where a Métis woman says to a priest when they hear that the Canadian forces kind of are on their way west, she says, "If the police come, we'll." Love that one. But yeah, so I mean, Métis, and like I think particularly Métis women really, like, and especially sort of, you know, in the years after the Reign of Terror, really knew exactly what the police were for and why they existed. But I will say, and I think it's important that we recognize this and that we don't shy away from it. Métis have been cops for a long time. So, for example, on Vancouver Island, it was often Métis who were hired to be police, to help police other Indigenous people. Sort of, I think it was in George Simpson's time, which is, you know, very complicated and nuanced to think about, and something that, you know, we, again, shouldn't shy away from, that we need to take responsibility for and really think about as we're thinking about what our responsibilities are to our First Nations relations. When it comes to sort of contemporary the valorization of cops, I'm actually really curious. I've never really thought about when that shift happened. I would guess that it is part and parcel to the overall assimilation project. You know, we were, as we sort of gained access to these mainstream institutions, you know, and again, because we aren't under status, we never had to we were never sort of officially, I guess, excluded from these professions in the way that a lot of First Nations people would have been, right? Because they're on the res, they can't leave the res, and or they would have needed to be, you know, enfranchised, lose their Indian status in order to participate in some of these parts of society. Whereas Métis didn't have that hurdle. We had other hurdles, but we more directly and more immediately could be rewarded for engaging in these systems. So I suspect, and again, this is just conjecture, but I suspect that probably has something to do with it, right? And like we really do valorize success, and often we valorize success kind of under a capitalist model, which I think, you know, is understandable given the process of assimilation. But it, you know, I think it is somewhat culturally based, right? It's just that success used to mean really different things for us back in the day. So I think it's something that we're navigating, and it's something that, you know, one thing I'll say about our political organizations, I have no beef with them when it comes to their service provision. I think in general, like Métis Nation of Alberta, for example, I think great at service provision. What they are not great at is historical and political education. And I think one of the most important things our quote unquote leadership could do would be to bring back that political education in the spirit of men like Jim Brady, in the spirit of women like Maria Campbell. Those strong critiques, you know, we are smart, capable, totally sweet people. And, you know, I think that a focus on political education and really giving and helping people to develop those analytical tools and that critical thinking could only do good things for us, and hopefully very quickly decrease the number of Métis RCMP at Back to Batoche and, you know, at various awards ceremonies and, you know, whatever it is, right? But yeah, so I suspect there's a bunch of reasons, but I do, and again, like that's all just conjecture. I don't know. Do you have any ideas?
You know, I think you do make a good point there with like Métis having been cops for a while now, and like I can even speak to that in my family. Like my grandpa was a police officer, and I think his parents, both of his parents were Métis. His mom went to residential school. They raised my grandpa and his brother, not telling them that they were Métis because they were white passing enough, and they just kind of wanted to keep that under the radar, which of course they found out a little later in life. But I think despite, I'm sure, my great-grandparents having negative experiences with cops, I think that they kind of saw that as a sign of him moving up in the world, you know, and I think that they were proud of that. So, but I mean, I guess that also just speaks to where our pride was at as a people at that time too. So yeah, I think there's that, and I think that also really kind of factors into, and now comes the time where I reference the man in the book that I reference in every episode. It kind of ties into like Howard Adams' idea of like appropriated Indigenous leaders, you know. So even like you mentioning that the Métis kind of had a little bit more agency because we didn't have to become like lose our status to like move out like more into urban spaces and stuff. I think that we were kind of like ripe to be appropriated into those settings and then just be used to police our own people as well as like our First Nations cousins. So yeah, but I don't know. Like it does seem like there's really like a shift of like just accepting policing is now vaguely now an overwhelmingly positive force in the world, and I don't know exactly when that started, but we're definitely like in the era of it right now.
I think too, you know, one other thing I wanted to draw out sort of from what you were saying, you know, you mentioned that your ancestors would have had all sorts of run-ins with the cops, which, I doubt there's a Métis alive who doesn't have ancestors who had some run-ins with the cops. So I think, there's the safety piece, there's the moving up in the world piece, there's the moving up in the world piece, there's the success piece, but there's also, that safety, right? There's a lot to say for, if you can get a family member who's a cop, like, there's probably some perks there, right? There's probably, at the very least, there's probably gives you a sense of safety, right? And of course, unfortunately, a lot of these police members just ended up arresting all their cousins and throwing, their relations in jail, as you said. But, I'm sure, for folks that have been so immiserated throughout the 20th century, like, it probably was pretty attractive to have somebody in your family who you felt like could help protect you because they were part of that system. So, again, I think there's probably a lot that has gone into it, but I think you're absolutely right that it's not working in our favor.
I think there is definitely something there about, like, almost like a little bit of like a if you can't beat them, join them type thing that brings, like, at least your immediate family some form of protection. Like, I even think of kind of like silly examples of like people I knew in high school whose parents were cops. And I remember one guy in particular telling me a story because his dad was like pretty high up in the local police force in the town I grew up in. And he was telling me about how once he was like in the car with a friend and the friend's dad, and they got pulled over for speeding way over the limit. And all he had to do was like sit in the back seat. He's like this 14-year-old kid, name drop his dad. And suddenly this guy like crumples up the ticket he's writing. He's like, oh yeah, just go ahead. Like there's like that sort of thing where it's like, I feel like police forces are so like protecting their own sort of thing, except in some of the cases that you mentioned of individuals stepping out of line, that, you're from a Métis family who's been having a real rough go, but now you got like a uncle who's like a cop now. You got that like little in that might provide you and your immediate family some protection, right? So, and then I guess as soon as you're benefiting from that personally, then you'll real quickly change your tune or your tone when it comes to policing, right?
Yeah, I think in our communities just in general, right? Like whether it's policing or whether it's, sort of moving into kind of a more hyper-capitalist mind state, right? Like I think there's work to be done there, for sure. But again, it's like we've had some amazing leadership over the years, working against that, working to bring that strong sense of like, our own peoplehood and our own, like, we're our own bosses, right? One of the things that I find so funny about, seeing Métis cops around is like, since when are you giving up your own, why are we okay with giving up our own autonomy? Like, we're the free people. Why are we subjugating ourselves to these systems? Right? Why are we applauding this? Right? And so I think, bringing back that political awareness, that political education, that critical thinking, and then also just, fostering a sense that like, we can't, like, we've been here. Like Daniel Voth, who you were talking about, right? And who I believe you've had on the show, has an absolutely amazing piece of work where he talks about Riel, basically saying, our sovereignty comes from the original lords of the soil, and the original lords of the soil are Indigenous women who have been here, holding it down, doing the thing since time immemorial. We don't need Métis cops. We are our own bosses. We are the free people. We've been the free people.
That is something that Daniel and I focused a lot on in the episode that we recorded together as well. And I think that I was actually about to bring it up, and I think that ties in nicely with what you were saying about these stories of Métis women being very anti-cop, because I think that there is something like that is like very like important to focus on, that it's like matriarchal knowledge that kind of like tells us that policing is not necessary. Because even with some of the stuff that Daniel talks about our hyper focusing on like Riel and Dumont is like these great native men of the past and like all this stuff, like, and also just the kind of real kind of appeal to this kind of like feeling of like being testosterone driven and then being given a gun and all this power. Like there's something that's very I don't know, like man coded about policing, and I think that it's like
Absolutely. Incredibly patriarchal.
yeah, it's interesting that all of the stories that you're drawing from are all from Métis women, and I don't think that's like coincidence, and I imagine you don't either. But yeah, it's matriarchal knowledge that's like anti-policing, and I think a lot of people might find that to be a controversial statement, but I think it's true. You know?
Everything that I've seen from the abolitionist movement from its inception has been women, queer people, two-spirit people, like heading it up, running the show, like generating the theories, doing the work. So yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And you're absolutely right. Like policing in prisons are inherently patriarchal and inherently violent in a very, very gendered way. We know, for example, that almost 50% of cops almost are domestic abusers. So I think, and we know that cops perpetuate just huge amounts of sexual violence and sexual exploitation. I mean, there's absolutely like blood-chilling stories of entire police forces. Just, I won't get into it, but I think, you know, you're absolutely right. And I think, you know, as Métis men started to be able to access these systems, Métis women were still excluded for a long time. And of course, that's now changing. Thank you, equity, diversity, and inclusion. But
that's going to fix
it. Yeah. We didn't have the same kind of safety net in that way. And then, of course, you know, if you were married to a cop, if you were the sibling of a cop, living with a cop, you know, whatever it is, right? You had that, it's that coin toss. Are you going to get abused?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Man, that's rough. I think it's also, I should point out too, that all of your solutions to the issue of policing have not been like, we're going to go to war with the cops, like we're fighting the cops. Like your solutions have been very...
It's only in Total Recall.
Yeah, but the solutions that you've been proposing are very much like replacing the whole penal system with more relational models for the most part, which I think is like very different than the kind of violence that a lot of people imagine abolishing the police being associated with. So yeah, so Molly, so you've been a member of Freelance Free Peoples, which for those who don't know is an Indigenous-led anti-colonial penal abolition group. And now that we've kind of like discussed a lot of the theory, I was wondering if you could tell me a bit more about like what the group does and kind of what kind of action it engages in that supports penal abolition. And specifically, I was hoping you could get into like what role the Indigenous leadership plays in the way that Freelance Free Peoples operates and how indigeneity informs the group's ideology. Like what makes this specifically Indigenous penal abolition rather than just your regular penal abolition?
Yeah, so I mean, I first want to say Freelance Free Peoples is on a bit of a hiatus at the moment. It's not defunct or anything like that, but we collectively decided that we're doing other kinds of work sort of around abolition. So, and, you know, I moved north and, you know, a big part of the group, why the group functioned so well and why the work was so nourishing was our relationships with one another. So we decided that since right now, anyway, those relationships can't look quite the same, we've just decided to continue doing the other work that we're doing. And if, you know, something comes up and Freelance Free Peoples is needed again, it's ready to launch. But when it comes to, I guess, the work, maybe to start out with, so we originally wanted to focus on sort of art and public education in relation to anti-colonial abolition. So firstly, sort of thinking about, you know, developing and drawing on theories of anti-colonial abolition. So looking at sort of the prison industrial complex, the penal system, as part and parcel of settler colonialism, as really, really part of its functioning. And then, of course, looking at Indigenous justice traditions, like particularly our own justice traditions, to sort of counter that, to provide alternatives, to start doing that generative work of prefiguring, that amazing, like, abolitionist future, an anti-colonial abolitionist future. Then, of course, COVID hit. So, as with every project and every relationship, things got a little derailed. But we were lucky enough that, members of our group were already pretty tied in with a lot of the abolitionist work that's been happening across the country. And there was an amazing group of abolitionists out of Toronto, actually, who had started a fundraiser to provide stipends to incarcerated and recently released people, sort of through COVID. Because as we know, like, if you're in prison, when you're let out of prison, they basically, like, give you a bus ticket and, like, the clothes you were wearing when you got in, and are like, okay, good luck, bye. And you're left with nothing, no services, no supports, absolutely nothing. So even, like, a little bit of money can go a really long way if you're recently released. And that we know that, the sort of conditions that people live with in prison are just absolutely atrocious. People not getting fed enough, really substandard food, sometimes food that's gone off. People make incredibly low wages in prisons when they have jobs and have access to labor. And the commissary items are incredibly expensive, and phone calls are incredibly expensive. So again, a little bit of money can go a really long way. And so we saw what was happening out in Toronto, and we basically got in touch and we're like, hey, could we just crib this model from you for the prairies? And they very generously said yes. And so we put together essentially a mutual aid campaign to provide stipends for, again, recently released and currently incarcerated people. We had some long discussions about, did we want to try to make this for only Indigenous people? If we did, like, how would we do it, etc. And we eventually decided, we're just going to make it for anybody who applies. And whether they are themselves incarcerated or recently released, or a relative of somebody. And the community absolutely just stepped the up for people inside. It was amazing to see. We raised, I think it ended up being close to $50,000, which is way, way more than we were ever expecting. And we got all of that money out to people, which was absolutely just incredible. And we did that just, basically crowdfunding through, kind of our own networks. People were really passionate about wanting to support people inside. And, on the prairies have some of the highest Indigenous incarceration rates in the country. And there is not a lot of abolitionist work that's been happening in the prairies. Most of the organizing takes place Vancouver, Toronto, some Montreal, and a little bit sort of East Coast, but not a lot sort of where some of the biggest problems are. So I think, a lot of it was just people were looking for something to do, looking for some way to support incarcerated people. A lot of people, even if they don't necessarily understand themselves as abolitionists or what have you, like, they know that policing's a problem. They know that prisons are a problem. And yeah, so that was amazing. And it did look like it ended up being that like most, if not all of the people who applied for the fund are Indigenous. We built some great relationships, and folks got really passionate about it. And it was also really interesting to try to navigate. I had some problems with the banks. I had to spend like an hour and a half in a bank office convincing the bank manager that I was not laundering money for a gang. Besides that, it went off pretty much without a hitch. And it was great to do. And aside from that, we've been doing public education. We did some writing, contributed some of our own analysis and our own theorizing to some great publications that came out. And And just really wanted to, I think, center an Indigenous and anti-colonial understanding of the role and purpose of policing in prisons, sort of within that settler colonial context. What does it mean for Indigenous people? How did policing in prisons in so-called Canada develop, and why, right? Like most of the abolitionist work up until quite recently actually has come out of the so-called United States, and really, really strong, really good, really foundational work, by thinkers down there for sure, but doesn't all translate up here. Obviously sort of the underlying anti-blackness of policing in prisons is of course the same. But because they're, Indigenous people up here are such a greater percentage of the population, and because of the way that colonialism played out up here and continues to play out up here, we felt that, we wanted to really foreground sort of settler colonization in particular, and the Indigenous experience of incarceration and policing sort of in what we were doing and in our analysis.
Man, well, I'd just like to congratulate you on the work that you've done with them. That sounds like amazing. Like you really made some huge impacts on like people who've been incarcerated like on their lives, which is just fantastic. Like I feel like we need to hear these stories more often, because so often these fights for our like liberatory movements feel so hopeless. But like when you hear about something like that, and you guys getting like $50,000, was it? Like that's fantastic. Like that's like just so good to hear.
And I mean, and the thing too that, people often aren't thinking about or don't entirely grasp is like, it was, and these were small stipends, like, and it really was just the most basic things that made a difference for people. People were buying like bed frames so they have somewhere to sleep. People were buying clothes so they could go to a job interview, food because they didn't have groceries when they got out, hotel rooms so they'd have a place to stay when they got out, phone calls to their families, things like that. And so it really doesn't take a lot, and none of us knew what we were getting into when we decided to do this, which I think is the other thing, right, is abolition, and I believe it's Miriam Kaba who says this, but I could be wrong, but abolition is a verb, not a noun. You do abolition. It's a practice. So, folks who are interested in abolition, folks who are interested in learning more about it, like obviously learning is a process of doing as well, but, there really are simple and often easy ways of intervening in these systems that can make a big impact. Like I can't take credit for what we were able to do. Like it really, like that was community work. That was the community that did that. We really just kind of administrated the thing and got the money out. But that was the community coming together and saying people should not be living in these conditions, especially not during a pandemic. So, yeah, so I say that because, I mean, hopefully, if there's, you got listeners out there who are excited about these possibilities and maybe don't know where to start or feeling intimidated or whatever it is, just go out and do it. Just go out and start something. If it doesn't work, try something else. Learn, try again, fail, try again, right? Like that's the good work.
I think that's a great note to kind of wrap things up on. Do you have any other thoughts that you want to share on anything that you said today, or just thoughts on penal abolition, or just plug some of the stuff that you're working on right now?
Yeah. I mean, I think abolitionist work is more important than ever, right? We're seeing carceral logics rear their heads everywhere you look these days. So whether it be, the genocidal logics underpinning what's going on in Gaza right now, in Palestine, the demonization of supporters of Palestine, warmongering sort of across the board, these global wars that we're being drawn into and that are being perpetuated by the Canadian government, of course, the demonization of immigration. We're really seeing that start to come up, especially in relation to the so-called housing crisis. All of these logics feed into each other. All of these systems feed one another and try to keep us away from each other, try to push us away in order to keep us isolated and in order to ensure that we can continue to be controlled. So I guess I would say that if you're interested in penal abolition, dive in. There's so much amazing, incredibly inspiring work out there. And it's so, I won't say it's easy. I say it's simple to get involved, but it can take, time, effort, labor, courage, all of those things. But it is so worthwhile to do that community building work and to do that imagining otherwise and that remembering otherwise. Find your people and go out there and make it happen. And don't let the powers that be tell us that some people are bad, wrong, evil, dysfunctional, irreconcilable, right? Because 99.999% of the time, that's false. And we can build the conditions for better living together. Yeah, I guess.
Absolutely.
That was a little bit of a motivational speech situation, but yeah.
Absolutely. Wow. I mean, if you're not hyped up after
I love
that,
getting corny with it.
yeah. If you're not hyped up after that, you never will be. That was fantastic. Yeah. Well, yeah. Thank you so much for coming on today and speaking with me, Molly. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk with you about this and not like the easiest topic to discuss. And you were just so well spoken the whole time, and I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with myself and with everyone who's listening to this. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you. It was a blast, and there's really no greater pleasure than to chat with a Métis about radical politics and imagining otherwise. Like I just love it. I'm so glad you're doing this podcast. It's so sweet.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you everyone for listening. This has been the Sickle and Sash podcast. We'll see you on the next one. Marcy.